Cool. Welcome to this FHIR Work Group. Yeah, so it was included a name change, and this was, I think, discussed in a previous meeting, perhaps to just make it distinct from the actual FHIR Maturity Model definition as part of the FHIR specification, and consequently a acronym change to AFMM. And there are notably some extra words added to the content. So just going through that, there's basically the original words are based on the FHIR maturity model as published, but noting we added no warnings or errors in our quality assessment for FMM1, and that the responsible work group has the option to accept the warnings as being known and understood. And I think that's been a common practice where it's either a publishing limitation or there's an understanding of why the warning is appearing. And the intent of the group is to actually is not. So basically the committee believes there's a reason for those warnings, and they're happy to accept that. So essentially that will be part of the discussion, I think, when it's passed up to the FHIR work group as to why those warnings are acceptable. And I think we went through that process with the AU Core specification already, where there was warnings that we were able to be accepted. So just adding those words into the actual line item. Just some nice rewording around FMM3 there, and noting that there was no definition as to what normative was actually in the R4 specification. That's been added in the R5 specification, and the words have been taken there from that. And adjusted for the Australian FHIR Work Group to be included in that statement. So, Richard.
Hi. I read through that. I've put a couple of extra comments in. So not all of those marks are yours. So
Cool.
I'd like them to be considered.
Sure.
When should I talk about them?
Talk to them now.
Oh, so actually, I've used the so if you go to the first one with the.
Yeah. Okay, so just nicer words.
Yeah. So if you click on that, that'll be, well, actually, I'm saying, why have you chosen the R4 one, not the R5 one? Because given that both are normative, I would expect that the R5 ones are better wording of the same one. And so I'm proposing that we use the R5 definitions of FMM.
That's a fair question, other than we're running an R4 spec, but obviously that's not this is a process description.
That seems all right to me.
Technical thing. Yeah. That would make sense.
Using the latest.
Yeah. So there'll wind up being a few little changes that flow on from that, but the thing being to consider rewording, doing it so it's using the R5 stuff instead of the R4 stuff, given that both are claimed to be normative. So that suggests that the R5 one is claiming to be a better expression of the same concepts.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. Cool. And then I had a couple more comments.
Shall I scroll through them, Richard? Oh, no.
There we go. Number 11, just meeting the in AFMM3.
Yeah, just to clarify.
Okay, so this is about the conformance resource quality guidelines, and they, I think, cover a slightly different use case. So just as we want AFMMs, we probably want a different set of conformance resource quality guidelines.
Yeah, that's a fair comment.
And so, and some of the alternatives, I'm not sure where the best one is. So do we consider all of it, or just the must support stuff in a particular one? And then do we cover, and then do we need to test everything that's already been tested and so on? So just some thoughts on that stuff.
Yeah, I think that would need we would have to probably take that away and review exactly what that means.
So I think it's a wonderful source document, but I don't think it's, and I think we could change the wording so inspired by, but I don't think we want to say follow.
No. Yeah. So I think that's a takeaway we can go and investigate, because that's not been analysed, I don't think, in detail as to what that would mean for anything other than a fire specification. So I can certainly take that on as an action to go and review that. Make a suggestion, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, the intermediate thing can say inspire. If we're in a hurry, the intermediate thing can say something like inspired by.
Sure we are in a hurry.
But if we've got the time, I think we should do an assessment of that.
Because I think I think I'm happy to take that away and just maybe we can go through that specifically in a future meeting.
Yeah. And I've got a comment on the last one, normative A. So the core spec doesn't require R5 before going normative. Why do we?
I'm happy to take advice.
Yeah.
It's a bit unclear actually. I was looking at that spec.
Yeah.
It's a little strange.
Yeah, there are historically times where things went from 3 to normative. I think probably because adoption was taken to be so wide that they just make it normative because they knew it would be too expensive to change. I've only saw the ZULIP reporting of those conversations, so I don't know what was the actual goings on with that. But if they've decided that they don't want to require you approve a level 5 before you go normative, we should think twice before doing something different.
Because I thought because I think the what are we looking at? The R5. See, R6 is another one because like R6 has FMM5 and then FMM6, which is normative. Basically says they call it FMM6.
Yeah.
So and there are different criteria. Yeah. Which is what I tried to reflect there too. So I think I'm not sure what's in R5. Yeah. Anyway.
Ruben, do you have a comment on this?
Not on this. That's a separate comment.
That's right.
Anyway, there's some actions there. I'm not sure this is super pressing, right? But I think it would be good to work through and come to
what we could do. One of the
statement.
things I like the idea of, because it's already in base, right? It's already in practice.
Yeah. And
I was just assuming, Ruben, you are going off on going to be talking about something else. I thought what we could do now is accept the AFMM and the name change, because I think that was called out as being one of the things that would be of significant improvement to clarify that this is localized.
My question was specifically on that point.
Go on.
It's not clear to me from the preamble of this page what the relationship between FMM and AFMM is. And it could be, as I see it, one of two things. It's either AFMM replaces FMM, or AFMM is our interpretation of FMM. So I'd like it clarified exactly what it is and how this is actually going to surface in practice. When we look at artifacts, are we going to see AFMM or just FMM, for example?
I think the proposal is that this is the localized version of FMM. Yeah. So
that's what it says now, but it's not.
Yeah.
Also, it replaces FMM.
Yeah, because the actual criteria are different in a local context. Yeah.
I take it that the idea is that for our own profiles, we won't be allocating FMM levels because some of them are just hard to do for the sort of derived profiles we're doing. But that for so that the stuff we develop would get AFMMs rather than FMMs.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think
So
That is my understanding.
it's too. Yeah, it's also there are specific call outs to the fire management group and specifically in the criteria and things like that. Plus what Richard's pointed out with the conformance quality guidelines as well, which I think we'll have to look at and decide if they make sense, because I think some of it's obviously aimed at fire specifications, which are not. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's even very. It's. I don't think it's ideal even for profiled artifacts as a set of criteria. So we have it. Yeah, kind of tried to localize it.
So this actually came up at the Dallas Working Group meeting at the International Council meeting where Graham was talking about FMM levels and affiliate specifications. His message was that it's fine to interpret them for your affiliate, but you can't, come up with an interpretation that goes against the definitions in the international core. That being said, I'm happy to flag this with Graham to have a look at and any comments if he has any.
And I think pretty much our intent was to not flout with the rules in terms of the criteria. So I think we even, I think we have very similar numbers even on systems and things like that are specified as being requirements. But it's it was pretty much just a reframing for Australian content. But yeah, we pretty much took the exact definitions and
Which
then
is
tweaked them.
in talking about replacing, I know I nodded to replacement because I do, and I thought it replaced it in the Australian context because we had localized it, that it was the localization of FMM within our affiliate. And therefore, when we're making the decisions about it, we'd be using the AFMM.
Yeah.
And I think that would be the sense it replaces it in, not as in,
Yeah, we're not, we can only say about our own standards.
I don't think that we should use the word replace. I think it should be sort of articulated as that the maturity level, the AFMM apply in the context of how the FHIR IGs and also the profiles are being sort of developed and used rather than sort of replacing. Otherwise, as I said, I said from the very beginning that the worst thing that we can do is to cause confusion. If we say that it's replacing, it sort of opens up all the problems including number one, people are saying that how did you sort of downgrade the maturity level while internationally is far more mature than what you have access to, and number two, that sort of what exactly does it mean, sort of in terms of interpreting those.
I mean, on that point about downgrading, that's a different artifact though. Like the FHIR resource itself has its maturity model definition. And even when they apply FMMs on US core profiles and IPS, that will have a different level to what the underlying FHIR resource is because it's the artifact.
I know that, but I'm saying that to avoid causing the confusion and the misinterpretation. So using the word replace is not, in particularly in my opinion, sort of helpful. So we should frame it in the sense that the AFMM levels are being created or localized in the context of its applications in how the AU profiles and IG matures.
Yeah, that's good. I think we can definitely put some more framing. Yeah.
So I'd say that our profiles don't get our profiles are not assigned FMM levels because they don't go through an FMM. They don't go through a process to assign them. We don't have the authority to assign them, but we do have the authority to assign a similar sort of classification code levels.
Why do you believe we don't have the authority to assign FMM levels to artifacts we're responsible for?
Well, none of our working groups are international working groups for a start. So I don't know
It
how we
doesn't-
get to level 1.
Doesn't the
Well-
process require the decision to be made by the FHIR management group?
It does. Yeah, that's the actual criteria. Yeah, so it is built around international standards development. So there's an assumption that they're international working groups responsible for the resource, and the FHIR management group has to approve it. So
Now,
explicitly, it says it in the criteria. Yeah,
it's probably worth advocating for there to be a delegate appropriate version of the FMM levels, as opposed to one which can only really be used by the universal realm.
Yeah, look, that is a really good point, and I'm going to take an action to follow this one up with Graham and FMG, because I think that needs to be an international statement around this that just clarifies things for all affiliates.
Yeah, I think Ruben too. It would actually, I think, be a useful thing as part of the FCP discussion, because I think it's a really important community grading, because it includes testing and usage and community activity as part of its definition, right? So I think it would be really helpful to have an FCP spin on that as well, in terms of that being a useful kind of concept. And that might be like, whilst we have a FHIR maturity model we're basing this on, I don't know, there might be other maturity models applied in an FCP process, right, that would be equivalent, or or we might just demand that these things are done, in a similar way. But but that's something I think that would be good as part of an FCP discussion, because it is like an evidence basis of community involvement as well, and also that you can't just kind of go from nothing to published normative standard without anything in between.
It plays out in a couple of places, but I do think that the rules around FMM can't be such that FMG has to approve everything. I think that's ludicrous. But at the same time, I do think that there needs to be an alignment with what affiliates are doing, like what's on the screen right now, and the international ones, with perhaps key elements that can be replaced. So
that's where I think maybe an FCP process might be good, because then you could get this kind of approach looked at, right? And
I think that it'll play out at the International Council level and FCP level, but there should be as little variation as possible. I agree with that point.
Yeah, cool. So I think that'll play out, but obviously we need to do something for now. So I think at the moment, I think I have a couple of actions there to go away and look at a couple of things. I take Danielle's point. We could just rename it, but I don't know, Danielle, if we could just, I think maybe I could come back with a few of the suggestion changes, and we can look at this again and get some more feedback too from international as available. Cool. I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. Okay, so so next on the agenda is our AU Core Base FMM2 evidence. Danielle?
I think I think this will be a ongoing discussion. So let's start it now, because this is a core and base, because they're really the only ones that are going to have anything to do with FMM2 in Australia in the short term, I think, like really short term. Though again, if someone on the line is managing PD and can chip in with the conversation, that'd be great. So we've got across AU Core and AU Base. Actually, I might share my screen. That might be easier then from that point to do a bit of driving. I'll Yes. And share screen. And let's time box this one. Because I think
Sure.
we can talk about this for ages, and we're going to have to split it across multiple IGs. So multiple,
How
sorry,
long do
meetings.
you want to?
What time
10
does this
minutes
meeting
or
end? 12:30?
12:30.
Let's go for 20 minutes, I think, maybe. And let's frame this out. I was just looking at the FMM levels actually, but I should go to the HL7 one. Let me just grab that, the link to that one. And I'll go to, should I look at the revised content, or is it fair enough to just use what's in AU base now? I guess we probably should just use that, actually. So we've got a number of things in our space that in base that are FMM1 now, and I think we need to consider whether or not they are actually at like we can mark them as FMM2. So I think we need to do a review of our FMM levels or AFMMs, whatever we get to, for AU based content. And certainly with AU Core, I think really the intention for the working standard, aka trial use, is FMM2, basically. So some of that we've been looking at testing in AU Core, and so I'm going to have some information and data, and I want to be able to have us as a FHIR Work Group have a discussion around FMM2, around what is defined here as the evidence you need, and then how will we make that decision? It's one thing to make it for core, it's another thing to make it for base, and it's also another thing for a standard that isn't, being run by an accelerator, and therefore has all the resources to do cool testing events and stuff to come in and provide evidence. So just looking through this then, it's been on the screen long enough, I guess, for people to read it for FMM2 about being tested. And then reading through tested and successfully supports interoperability among at least 3 independently developed systems. I read that as testing from at least 3 independently developed systems. Not that one system's tested it and claims it successfully supports interoperability amongst 3. And it says leveraging most of the scope, and that's an EG 80% is what they've got, using semi-realistic data and scenarios based on at least one of the declared scopes of the artifact. And they've got here, e.g., this might be, for example, at a connectathon. And that the results must have been reported to and accepted by the responsible work group. Now, we've not been, I guess, to the letter of the law necessarily on this, which I think is quite fine, because I think in a lot of cases we've called out existing implementations where we've talked about where something is actually already implemented as counting as a system that is testing and successfully supports interoperability, and based on the knowledge of the people who have implemented and are using those systems have described, I guess, which parts are implemented. So if we take AU base, for example, and we look at what's one of our FMM ones? This would be interesting. So actually FMM1, I don't think we've got any real, we've got some base profiles. And let's look then at this. So we'll have this discussion on AU-based diagnostic request. Where's that at? So that's marked as FMM1. So this is, we're deriving from that and being compliant to it in eRequesting, right? But we're only marking parts of it with must support an obligation. And then we're going to go through and do testing on those things. And so I think part of the conversation I wanted to have about what is considered from a base perspective, that 80%. So I would suggest for things like eRequesting, that we're looking at, if we just go there, for things like eRequesting and for things like core, if we're talking about profiles, I think we're talking about the elements on which we've placed constraints, like things that we've marked as must support or obligation. So I would suggest that's what the scope is if we read the FMM level, which is looking for 80%. We'll just go back to that phrase. Apologies for all jumping around. That's looking at supporting 80% of the core data elements.
Do you think that means 80% of the things we've put obligations on, or 100% of the things we put obligations on?
Yeah, so I think this is where someone has to, when they're presenting it, like, what do we want to do?
I think
yeah, Brett?
I think it's at each level, right? So we have a profile at AU base. It's got 6, 7, 8 elements or whatever, and you know, I'd say you take that and look at that and go, well, what's the usage? And
so I mean, here for AU base, would you say you've only got to support, say, the things that you've profiled, or do you have to support the whole resource?
Well,
to do
in
the
terms
testing?
of
Yeah,
testing,
when we're testing, okay, we've tested that you can use identifier, but we don't need to test that you work with any of the elements that are not profiled.
Yeah, I think if they're not profiled in AU base, yeah,
then you don't need to assess it as part of an AU base maturity
sorry,
level.
hang on. We would make the assessment of the profile as a whole, but I think that 80%, these are the constraints we've placed in the profile are the things we're looking at the 80% of.
Yeah.
So if we did only have evidence of testing, or we'd only tested, I guess, 80% of these rules, then...
So someone implements eRequesting, they're going to do identify code requester reason.
Yeah.
Maybe that's all.
Well, if they've just done identify a code requester, they haven't done 50% of what we profiled here.
Yes. Or like if that's all the evidence we have is that we've only got testing of those elements, then I would suggest we haven't met the 80%.
But if we've done everything but body site, we have met the requirements to do 80%.
Possibly.
Yeah. Yeah.
5, 6, 7.
You might get away with that one.
7, 8. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, 7, 8. True, because otherwise you've got to do them all, right? So it's yeah. So these are good questions because, like, if it's going to be a hard rule, then that's the different. You know, that's another thing. And there's also, I guess, options within an element because you might have, like, say for patient, you've got half dozen identifier data type profiles. Do you have to actually use those?
So then, in terms of that, so let's go look at patient. So
on requester, do you have to have dealt with all of the referred types?
Choices, yeah. So
for identifier, I would be expecting in core, we need to do the testing for just generic identifier, but also IHI, Medicare, and DVA, because we are supporting, specifically marking out that this profile is calling out for support for these 3. That's what I think. And not
in AU base
card or anything. Yeah,
in AU base, I would consider all of those options as being things we should have tested to count in the 80%, right? So it's whilst it's one element, I think there's like half dozen options, right, for that element.
So here at AU base, we need to have tested both identifier.
Actually, maybe I'll take that. I might take it back because that profile has its own.
We don't have to.
Yeah.
The reason we don't have to is because they're not sliced, and exactly each of those identifier types. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll take that back because that's kind of yeah, true. We haven't said you must use them anywhere, or so they have their own independent maturity.
Do you have to have tested? Does counting the things for the 80% to include all of the extensions?
Ones that we add into AU based patient. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that will help us delete a few of them.
Yeah. So the thing is,
because nobody uses them.
So do we have to test 80% of the total, or perhaps we've got to test all of our extensions?
Well, I think they count just as like elements.
So each extension count, each
Yeah.
extension on the resource count says 1 towards the total that you have to do 80% of. And then if we scroll down, we've got other extensions like accuracy indicator and birth time. The accuracy indicator shows up twice. Do we need to test accuracy indicator just once, or do we need to count it as two things because it shows up in two places?
Two, wherever it's
because they're
called
different
out.
context. Yeah.
Yeah. So birth date accuracy indicator and deceased date accuracy indicator are two different elements for counting for the testing purposes.
Yeah, because I think this is the reality of FMM, right? It's if nobody's using these things, should we be saying anything? Because we can never progress if nobody's using it.
So it's 80% of the things that you introduce in your difference have to be tested.
When it's a profile,
Yeah.
yes.
So yeah, so for AU
Well,
base, which has no must supports
No,
to provide guidance
actually,
on what you need to support, we've got to test 80% of the extra things we add with the differential.
Differences.
and
Yeah.
I'm going to qualify that actually because we're going to go further. I think for core and eRequesting, I think that is an appropriate judgment call for base because base is just on top of the FHIR resource, FHIR standard. I think in core there are things that I've done nothing but put a must support on. But I still believe that needs to be tested in the context of AU Core for it to count.
Yeah.
So I think even if all I've done is just do the obligation, I think the full actually test the element itself, like that extension needs to be done.
Yeah.
So that is the scope, is I guess everything that, well, so let's say in a core perspective, it is both everything that we introduce, because that includes, obviously we've got invariance up here, and then all the elements for which we declare support is required for core. I think that's what we need to do.
So everything you constrain, everything you introduce, and everything you make a support assertion on.
Yes.
So it's everything in the differential still.
Yeah.
No, it's more. It is more. Sorry, hang on. What I mean is there are more things that need to be tested than just what's in the differential, because I will inherit things. So
yeah, you need to test all of the Indigenous status extensions use. You don't need to just test that it's supported.
That's probably not what I was going to call out. Not that part, because I'm not so sure about that. I was thinking invariance that I pull in from base, because I've made a choice to derive from base. I think that counts in terms of testing. So if we look at in the key elements, this one might not be a good one. But if, for example, there was some AU base invariance, and because I'd chosen to derive, I pulled in those invariants. I believe that counts in terms of have you tested 80% of the things in your profile? Because I've made a choice that my profile includes not just the core FHIR stuff, but also includes those rules because they're active. They fire, right, on the instance. They're part of AU Core's conformance requirements.
So everything that you inherit between the FHIR spec and the profile you've got, you have to include that in the things you're counting?
You have to look at them to see if you are. Like, I'm not going to
I don't
pick,
know if you count.
I'm not
I
going to
don't know
say
if you
veteran
ever count
status.
them because they
right.
work at each layer, right? So it's, yeah, I kind of just go, yeah, you got to test the invariants you've added.
Right.
But you're not responsible for those invariants. You just
Well, I
inherit
guess
them.
you can't violate the
Yeah.
invariants.
Well, you can't, right? So
But I could make a choice to profile differently. Okay, you've brought me around. I'm no longer going, I'm going to come back to...
Makes it easier to understand.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that forms the scope then. Like in AU base, that's the scope, is everything you introduce. In things like core and e-requesting, it's everything that you have. How did you phrase it, Richard? I think it was good. There were 3 points.
Everything you constrain, everything you add, and I can't remember what the other one was.
Oh, it's everything you
support.
Yeah.
Oh, and support. Everything you support, they have an obligation. Yeah. So yeah, constraints, additions, and obligations.
And I think that makes up these are the things for which you have to be declared FMM2. 80% of those things that we just talked about need to have testing from 3 independently developed systems.
Right. So in this context, that's what core means.
Yes.
I've got a question, just because in the world of obligations, are they testable?
Yes, they're tested. They are to a certain degree. They can be. We're not actually. This is not the machine processable part, but in terms of some of the obligations might be testable. I would expect. So in terms of this artifact, I wouldn't put that, because okay, hang on. Gathering my thoughts. I don't believe the actioning of the obligation is part of the profile testing. It's part of the capability statement testing. That's where that gets exercised.
I could suggest
each
a
of
slightly
these
different one is that if you've got an obligation on it that you've introduced, then you are required to test that the element can be populated and that the element can be accepted.
Which is, I guess, what we're saying about you have to test this element because it has an obligation on it. We're just not saying you have to test this exact phrase, because I don't think those are testable in a profile context.
That's it. So having an obligation makes you an element to be counted when you're deciding what you need to test.
Yes.
And the nature of the obligation is actually doesn't affect that.
Not in terms of FMM for this profile. It comes only into capability statements.
It's really, in that case, it's really nothing, because we know you can populate it. We know you can read it.
If you've tested the element.
It's FHIR, right? That's guaranteed.
No, it's not. I've written extensions that are impossible to actually achieve on the wire.
Yeah, you might not have, in all of your examples, you might not have used that element. And if in none of your examples did you use the element, then it hasn't been tested. But if we've got a must support on it, then we say, no, you've got to show you can actually use that structure.
Yeah, that's hard to check, but yes.
It's not. I mean, so just what Richard and I are saying, and I think that's even what you're saying, is having an obligation means that element is in scope of testing, not that you have to test that exact obligation phrase.
I think that's fair.
And at the moment, so with that definition of core, so far it's going to kind of hold true for e-requesting, though noting again this is pretty early, but it looks like that that definition would also apply to eRequesting and therefore might work for any downstream IG. So I think we're time boxed, and that was the start of the conversation.
Yeah, that's good.
And let's test it with trying to assess some things in a later meeting.
Yeah, because I guess later we'll have that testing, those testing events will get formulated into some evidence basis for acceptance.
Yeah, I've got it.
Right, so
like,
we're
looking at, you know, all the different elements and which products are testing them and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. So yeah,
I mean, I think
there.
too, like this is good hygiene for standards, and I'm very keen for this stuff to be part of the whole AFCC FCP discussion, because I think these kind of processes are actually really important in getting quality content. So rather than specs being pushed through and without any basis of reality is what we want to avoid generally, and like we can make it happen in HL7 AU specs because we have the power in the FHIR Work Group to say that's how it is. But yeah, I want to kind of broaden out those ideas too into the broader FCP space, because I think some of these things are important. Anyway, thank you.
Okay. So we have 2 items left. That one's saying 30 minutes, but we only have 30 minutes left. So
I'll tackle one, see how it goes.
Okay.
So this is the additional bindings. I had an action on me to send out the medication and immunization profiles and update that based on our last meeting. I have done that. I only sent it out to everybody last night, so you might not have had a chance to look at this. So the thing that's being proposed is refactoring to use additional bindings instead of slices. So I've trimmed this proposal so that all that is involved in this proposal is about just refactoring to use additional binding. What was in the previous proposal was about let's actually update the main conformance binding. And I've removed that. That's going to be a separate topic if we get to it. And this is just about the slices. And so it is just transforming each of the slices into an additional binding. What's proposed is using the word preferred and describing the context for them. So if we look at what that looks like now, you come down and boy, do I really like this because it's so much cleaner, is it looks like this. So that's the list instead of the slices, which if we come around to medication, which is the current profile here, is what that is. These slices are now captured as a list of additional bindings. You'll note Graham has made the improvement that we were actually looking for to link off to what does this term preferred mean, because we had a problem when we were looking at them with path result before, which had component and you couldn't click on it. But now this has preferred, which has a mouse over, and it actually goes off to what does preferred mean. And it uses this binding strength here. And just to show you what that looks like with the documentation. Oops. I have to get maybe key elements. Sorry, that's what that looks like there, where you list a value set for use when Australian medicines terminology preferred, PBS, MIMS, G10. So it keeps the same binding as we've always had in the main conformance binding, which if you didn't know is a SNOMED medication code. That's set in the FHIR standard. We've never changed that in our base profiles.
That's just the example, example binding.
Yeah, it is. It's an example binding.
Yeah. So effectively no binding.
Yes. Yeah. If you were looked at the FHIR standard, we inherit that one. So that
Yeah.
looks like there. That's it.
Yeah. So conformance-wise, it would make
No difference.
no difference. Yeah.
So that's the proposal, is to clean up the slices, put them in here. That lets us get rid of the discriminator that's inhibiting some of the downstream choices when you derive from base and picking that up. And I think it also looks so much cleaner.
I would move we accept this method across the whole medication terminology use.
And then
Well-
for the people on the line who don't read this all the time, this exact set of value sets and slices is across all of the
So
AU-based medication statement and so
that's-
forth.
Yeah.
Looks
So
the
it's
same.
medication request, medication administration, medication dispense.
Yes.
This certainly looks to work nicely for when we've got all bindings that are preferred bindings. At some stage, we'll want to look at to see whether it works as well when you've got slices with different binding strengths.
And well, it depends on what you want to do with, what was the
Yes.
intention behind the slicing? Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think the original, basically slicing was the only tool we had to describe any binding to to the medication's terminology. So this is a much better mechanism, I think, for expressing what we wanted to say anyway.
And
Plus
Richard's
it has
alluding.
the upside of no constraints downstream. Yeah.
Yeah. And Richard's alluding
Yes,
to the fact that it won't be this simple when or if we get to looking at the organization profile and the practitioner role, which have a hierarchy of preference, which is not this. This is just a nice flat list, the same as the slices.
Can we talk about the extension too?
Which one?
The medication type.
Go for it. It's on screen. Do you need me to click on anything?
So no. So you can see there is a coding extension there, the medication class, which is the medication type extension. So that was one that was explicitly expressed against AMT entries. As there's a description of what that is in the extension, but it's to support identifying which level that the AMP code is operating at. Any coding system really. So it's not specifically for SNOMED. It's for it's been looked at with other terminologies as well, and it's really to express things like the equivalent of like MP, MPP, and all those kind of classes in terms of the levels of the code. So it's essentially a shortcut for to be able to identify if there's multiple AMT codes, which whether they're branded or unbranded or what level they're operating at, which is very helpful for systems that don't have terminology capability downstream. So so that is something we explicitly had on the AMT codings, and so what's happened is now, since we have additional bindings instead, that's just become a general extension on coding as an option for any term, which is possible to use it on any code, but yeah, that's effectively an effect of moving AMT into a additional binding.
In a way, that's nice because you can use it anywhere. It's just that people have got perhaps less interest in using it anywhere.
Yeah. But in the light of our previous FHIR discussion, it's now making me worried. So. Yeah.
Cool.
Anyway.
So
yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments, or should we motion to approve the proposal as described? It is across medication, all the medication profiles. So AU-based medication, AU-based medication administration, AU-based medication statement, AU-based medication dispense, and AU-based medication request.
That would be I would like to motion that.
And I will second because it's my proposal, so I should.
Just checking the scope. This is just in medication and immunisation. Yep.
This is just
Oh
medication.
no, just medication.
Just
Yeah.
medication.
I do have the next one, which is immunizations, but because it doesn't look exactly like this, this is the vote on
It's
just the
different.
medication profiles.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a motion and a seconder. Do we have anyone that wishes to abstain? If you can put your hand up in the chat. Nope. Okay. Anyone that wishes to vote negative? Nope. Okay. So we have 12. Motion passed.
All right, and as Richard nicely pointed out for our next one, same thing with immunization. So let me just bring up our current immunization profile. This one looks less messy.
Richard. Sorry, Richard has his hand up.
I'm just wondering, when we say 12 approval, does the chair vote or does the chair not vote? I've noticed that.
No,
in
the chair doesn't
international-
vote.
Oh,
So
sorry.
that would be,
that would be
11.
11.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the last one would be 13.
Sorry, Jamie.
And the one
Yep.
before that would be 11.
Yeah,
I've
all
remembered
good.
the
I'll
numbers.
adjust that. Thanks.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, no, past that. So this is what the immunization profile looks like. Same approach we took at the time because that was the tool we had available, slicing, to call out that there's AMT and there's also AIR codes. So the proposal is that we move these into additional bindings. And I think I've got a link here, what that looks like, and that looks like that now, basically. So again, we're not touching the main conformance binding, and we're moving those slices into 2 additional bindings.
Was the air binding required in the previous view?
It's not, because it's an
No.
optional slice. So in order for a slice to technically function, see, now this is, as Graham pointed out, this is actually incorrect. You can, every one of your slice bindings needs to say required, but that doesn't mean it's a required support. That just means that this is an optional slice.
Yeah. When you use the slice, it's required. Yeah.
And then it was it's only this way because it's technically necessary. Sorry, I'll stop using the word required when I don't mean the binding strength. It is technically necessary when we listed the optional slices to have a required binding strength there for it to work. This did have some normative implications that we didn't want. It didn't mean that we prefer you to use AMT, but you are required to use air. You can't apply those binding strengths as preferences on your use of terminology. Overall, here's 2 terminologies for use. Basically, that's what these 2 slices does. It also did a few more things because there's a discriminator, and we want to avoid doing that because that wasn't the intention.
Yeah, it actually creates constraints downstream by doing
It does.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason to move to additional bindings, is that we remove the confusion of the binding strength on these slices in making people think that something is required for use. Anything else people would like me to walk through before we motion?
Could we just check the detailed words in the description?
Oh yes, good point. Sorry. Key elements. If we approve this proposal, I'll turn that into the actual things rather than just the word AIR, which was just short form for this. I'll get that reviewed, obviously, for spelling and grammar.
Yeah, and it should be noted, this, of course, would go into ballot, so feel free to comment as you want.
I think it would be, and this isn't something we can do, but I think it would be nice if the publisher gave the additional bindings heading a link off to the additional bindings documentation.
Oh yeah, this bit.
Yeah.
Do you want to add a GitHub and suggest it as an improvement?
Yeah, me and my big mouth.
Yeah.
All right. If there's no other comments, then this time I'll motion that we accept the proposal for AU-based immunisation to refactor the slices into additional bindings as shown.
I'll second it because it's a lot clearer than slices.
Okay, thanks, Danielle and Michael. Okay, so we will vote. So if I can have anybody that wishes to abstain, please put up your hand. Nope. Okay, anyone that wishes to vote against, please raise your hand. Nope. Okay, so we have 11 for and motion pass. Thank you.
I'm going to stop screen sharing because I think that was the last of the things that I had to show today.
Sure, I will reshare.
Ruben, is that about the bindings?
Yeah. Yeah, well, not specifically those tracker items, which I'm very happy with, but a question regarding the AU-based position on allergies to medications. Does our profile of allergy intolerance intended to capture allergic reactions to medications? And if so, should this binding treatment be applied there? Happy to for you to take that on notice, Danielle.
Yeah, because I think at the moment all I was doing was going through and I guess cleaning it up a bit, not really intending to substantially improve anything beyond clarification. But I think that would be the right approach if we find that the binding itself already isn't suitable, that we could consider ways to call out specific items.
Yeah. So I've had a look at the profile and it seems the current binding is to the NCTS adverse reaction agent reference set, which is purely SNOMED. I'm not sure whether all of these medication code systems are appropriate there, but it's probably worth having a discussion.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, is that an action on you, Danielle, or?
No, I'm not doing
Nope.
anything yet. I mean, I'm going to think about it, but I'm not like promising to like do something in the really short term.
I think we welcome ballot comments.
Yeah, that might be a good way to do it.
Oh, yeah. I'll keep that in mind as a ballot comment.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, though. It's a good question. Yeah.
Okay. So talking about ballot, that's our next agenda item. We have 12 minutes left. So review timelines for the ballot. Somebody have those?
Oh, yeah, I can do that one.
Thanks.
I might just share my screen just to point at a few timelines. Yeah, there we go. So this is in the HL7 Australia space, and there is a section here that is worth knowing about where there's ballot announcements. So basically this will continue to be populated as new ballots occur and with details. So the upcoming ballot, we have key dates specified. So just going through, and I think this covers a few of the items. You know, there's the key dates of signing up and participating in the ballot. This is now aligned with the kind of ballot process timelines that have been devised to help us get through the process. We've already had our notice of intent to ballot ballots done, so that's already that date is passed, but also that has been completed for the items going to ballot, and we're heading towards having a sign-up period starting on the 8th of July. So there is like nearly a month there for signing up to that process, and then we'll have our published version coming out on the 5th of August. And then there is a week interim period as all the ballot gets set up and we get ready to actually get voting. But of course, the actual IGs will be available for review at that point, so you can happily start creating issues and then start voting on it when the 12th voting starts, and we have our nearly a month again to vote, and at which time we will close the voting and move on to reconciliation processes after that. It should be noted there is a connectathon in the middle of that voting period, so that's another chance for people to sort of test and feedback any other issues with that spec, which will be the one that's available for the connectathon. So what we're covering this time, we've actually got 3 artifacts going to ballot at once, which is by far about 3 times as big as any previous about voting and balloting. So we will be doing AU Base and AU Core, looking to essentially do working standard versions of that, which it's the trial use level of those specs. So mainly that's to get an R1 version of AU Core available and usable. And we're also doing a draft for comment against the eRequesting content, which is still early days in getting that together for the first round of real balloting. So as per the previous draft for comment round for AU Core, you have to be an HL7 Australia member to vote. Organisations have a number of voters. So depending on the tier of your membership, and individuals, of course, can vote as well. You have to be signed up to Confluence, and I imagine all the people in this group probably are already, but there's a mechanism there to, there's details there, so if you have other people in your organisations that need to do that, that's a necessity. And in fact, it's needed now to be able to even sign up for the ballots, so you won't be able to access the sign-up form unless you're registered as a HL7 Confluence Jira user. So you won't, basically that page is restricted, so you won't be able to get through to the ballot. And once we're in there, there's actually once you have that access, you'll be able to get through the sign-up page. There's no sign-ups yet because it's not open, but that's all ready to go in terms of signing up. It's similar to the previous sign-up process, but with the 3 specs. So you just indicate which specs you are signing up for, and that will be our process. So I guess there will be comms coming out on this very shortly. I think hopefully I'll get some comms out shortly especially about signing up for HL7 accounts, because they take a few days to get organised, but hopefully there's enough time in the program there for people to get all that done. And hopefully with this new way of locking the sign-up form we get less problems with identities and problems with the actual voting procedure. So that's probably all I have to say about that stuff.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there's anything else in those items that was. There will be reconciliation, but
yeah,
we've got some weeks to talk about that probably. So probably come back to that later.
Can we talk about the next? I know we're coming down to time. Talk about the next meetings, like the agenda for them. Because we've got 2 before we do an AU based snapshot, and our next meeting is the mid-year project check-ins. So we're expecting, I think, 50-60 minutes of our meeting to be taken up with that, and then we've got, I guess, the space for a couple of topics to get through, and then we've got one more meeting, and then to make changes, I guess. And there's some more I'd like to flag around the work that Ruben has been doing in terms of clarifying some of the parts of person recorded sex or gender that we need to go through, and then also evaluate if we're happy to mark those items as FMM1 and take them to ballot, which, you know, I think we should be taking the work we've been introducing on sex and gender to ballot. Are there any other burning items for people in terms that they think we need to get them done, and in the ballot snapshot, so they can actually go through that ballot process?
I know Richard had an item, but I don't know how burning it is.
Does it need to be
we had talked
pre-ballot,
about before.
or can it be post-ballot? Or can it be like
Or
a
in
ballot
the
comment?
ballot. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it like a new structure?
No.
No, it's relaxing something in AU base. So AU base related person is not actually part of AU Core, but the current version of it has an extensible binding that we'd like relaxed to being a preferred binding.
All right. If it's really urgent, then we can make sure we prioritize that amongst the set of things pre-ballot. If not, is it okay if we prioritize firming up the sex and gender terminology and things that we introduced to get those in ballot shape, and you could mark your comment in terms of voting as actually like a ballot comment, and then we need to address it in reconciliation?
Yep. I think that will.
Yeah, I would actually back you up, Richard. So I think it was. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to look at.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Because I think it makes sense with an AU Core potential profile. I think it makes sense. Cool.
If we got 2 minutes, Danielle, is it worthwhile mentioning the self-pay code going into THO? Or
you're on mute, Daniel.
I'm on mute. That's a thing that we have to address before ballot. I don't think we can do that now because there's I guess maybe you can go for it. We do have to fix that prior to ballot.
Right. So just quickly, I can't share my screen.
Sorry if I stop.
Yeah. I've got to click share. I'm not used to this. All right. So this
would help.
Okay. So this is it's one of our value sets in base, and what it does is it includes there's 2. I think there's 2 codes in this one. One comes from international, one comes from Australia. This one is like self-pay with concession or something like that, which is going to be promoted into the THO next release, which happens mid-July. So if we want this in ballot, so we get rid of this extra include, then I can do a JIRA or something like that, put it in and put that in for ballot. It just sort of tidies up that value set a bit.
Just it's the code. It's a code. It's the issue is more at the code system level, Michael, where we wanted a particular code that didn't exist in international yet. We initially
Yeah.
added it in an AU code system, but international's accepted it. This hasn't been balloted yet, so we can remove the AU code now that we know that international has accepted it, instead of, you know, having a problem. So that's what we need to do, and we'll write up that proposal in JIRA and bring that back to us to agree. But this hasn't been you can see its maturity level is like 0. This hasn't been balloted yet, so we can take this out before we stick something in whose sole purpose is to be deprecated.
Yeah. So that's my task. I'll get that JIRA done, and we'll have to get it on the agenda prior to the next release of THO.
Yeah,
So
and
that
if
was all it
anyone
was.
finds any similar things that we really need to clean up before ballot, that would be great.
Good stuff, Michael. It's better that it's published there than us having to look after it.
Yeah.
One less artifact.
Fabulous. All right. I think we are done then until our next meeting, which is when that
Should be in a fortnight, so the 17th.
Yeah.
Yep.
17.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next
Well
time.
done.
Thank
Well done,
you.
Chair.
Well
Right on
done.
time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.